In today's video, we're talking about neutral density filters, what they are, when to use them, how to use them, and when not to use them. Stay tuned. So there seems to be a lot of confusion out there as to what a neutral density filter is and what it's used for and when to use it. Now, if we take a look at a neutral density filter versus the regular filter that comes on it, this is just a clear piece of glass, nothing special. When we start looking at neutral density filters, this is an ND4. It's darker, but I can still see through it pretty good. When we get into the darkest ones, here's a 32, it looks pitch black. And in here, with this lighting, I can barely make out anything through it. So the question is, why? Why do we need these? We definitely heard when the P4 Pro came out, we're offering them neutral density filters in the store. They're like, I don't need neutral density filters. It has an adjustable aperture. I'm only going to need something like that on the Mavic Pro or the P3, the P4, or the Mavic Air that I have here. That couldn't be further from the truth. Now the reality is, when we're shooting stills, okay, trying to take a photograph, it's very, very rare that you're going to need a neutral density filter, because all these things are doing are cutting down the amount of light going into the camera. The more light we cut down, the longer the shutter speed we're going to have. If I have a fairly dark ND filter on one of my aircraft, I have to have a long shutter speed. Now, in most cases, that could cause motion blur. It can cause all kinds of things. It will not keep your images from being washed out. And that's what we see online quite a bit, is people saying, oh, you're overexposed. Get a neutral density filter. No, just increase your shutter speed. That's all you have to do to get it right. Now, we're going to do a video on the histogram and how to use that to make sure you're getting the right exposure, but a neutral density filter is not about getting your exposure right for stills. Now, for video, it's completely different. Well, one more thing while we're talking about photos is there is a reason to have very dark filters. And in here, I actually have an ND64 filter. Now, the only time I'm going to use that is when I intentionally want a long exposure shot in the daytime. Now, one reason is going to be doing light trails. So here, this was a 5-second exposure over this roundabout. Really shows what you can do with a long exposure. This next shot is from Bridal Veil Falls in Telluride, Colorado, where I needed to get about a 2-second exposure to get that really smooth, silky look on the waterfall in broad daylight. So in that case, I go with a really dark neutral density filter. I still had to crank down the aperture on the P4 Pro so that I could get the right exposure and still get about a 2-second shot. So that's the only time we're going to use neutral density filters for photography. Otherwise, we're just using a clear filter so we can get the fastest shutter speed possible and freeze that image without any motion blur. On video, it's a very different beast. In video, we want kind of a long shutter speed. Not super long, but long enough to introduce motion blur from frame to frame so that our playback doesn't look all choppy and staccato-like. So what happens is, let's say I'm outside. Today was a very bright day, and I'm shooting. I got my ISO all the way down, and I have my aperture closed down, but my shutter speed is something like 1/3000th of a second. So it's going to take a shot, and it's going to wait, so 1/30th of a second to the next frame, take another very fast shot. During that time, if I have any movement at all, it's going to jump from frame to frame. So when I play it back, it's going to look jittery. When I put a neutral density filter on there, I'm running a longer shutter speed. So I'll get a little motion blur in one frame, a little motion blur in the next frame, a little motion blur in the next frame, so that when it's played back, it looks perfectly smooth, giving you a much more cinematic shot. Now the goal when we're doing that is to have your shutter speed at double your frame rate. So if I'm shooting at 30 frames per second, I want my shutter speed to be 1/60th. If I'm shooting at 120 frames per second, I want 1/240th. So double your frame rate to get your shutter speed. That's going to give you the right amount of motion blur to keep it from looking all jerky. Now, when it comes to these things, again, this particular package, this is from Taco RC. It's one of the products that we sell. Comes in a 4/8/16/32 and just attaches to the front of the camera. Now, I have these available for both Phantom 4 Pro and Mavic Pro. A lot of people are like, I can't get the original filter off. How do I do that? I'm twisting, I'm turning, it's not budging. Well, see if I can do this so that you can see it. If you grab the side of this, it's not going to budge. All you're doing is holding it in place. You want pressure on the front with a little twisting motion. Any pressure on the sides, and you're just locking it in place. So push down on the front bezel, give it a turn, and these things come right off. So sometimes putting a rubber band around it so you can get a little friction can help. Rubber gloves can help. But I find as long as I'm just pushing on that front, I don't have any problems. So this is very similar to the way the Mavic Pro works or the Mavic Air. So I'll take the gimbal cover off the Mavic Air, and what you'll have on here right out of the box is just a balance ring. So this thing was designed to have neutral density filters. So on this guy, I want to tilt the camera up a little bit and grab it and just, again, twist on that very outside right behind the glass, and it'll come right off. Putting it back on, same thing. Now I don't want to run this without either a filter or the original balance ring, because the gimbal will be out of balance and it's going to create some unstable shots for you. So, neutral density filters, little recap. Unless you're doing something that requires a long exposure shot, there's no need whatsoever to have neutral density filters on your camera when you're shooting stills. Period. There's no reason for it. You're going to get longer shutter speeds and possibly introduce motion blur and shake, which is going to degrade the quality of the image. On video, we want to kind of lock in a couple settings. We typically want the lowest shutter speed we can do, and we want double the frame rate as our shutter speed. That leaves the only two things that you can adjust to get your exposure right, either aperture on cameras that support it, or neutral density filters to get you in the ballpark. And then a little tweak here and there on the shutter speed's not going to hurt anything. It's just you want to be as close to that optimum as possible. How do you determine which filter to use? Well, you kind of play it by ear. After a while, you'll actually get used to seeing the sky and going, it's kind of only an ND16 day today. Oh man, it's really bright. It's an ND32 kind of day. Now understand, on the Phantom 4 Pro, you can use lighter ND filters because you can adjust the aperture. So you have a little more wiggle room. On something like a Mavic Pro or Mavic Air, it's going to be an ND4, 8, a 16, 32, 64, and that's it. So you're going to want to get in the ballpark as close as you can, and then you'll adjust your shutter to get your exposure. So again, coming up soon, we will do a video on how to adjust your exposure using your histogram to make sure you get that shot dialed in perfectly. This has been Kerry. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.